Chapter 211, Battling the Shatter Shield. A devastating mix of crimson lightning and golden fire clashes with salvos of unnaturally cold ice magic, the very air turning dangerous for those without adequate protection as the rebel mage attempts to gauge my defenses and I attempt to refine my combat spell casting by stealing from the man's experience. Was it arrogant to use this battle as a training exercise? Yes. Did I care? Not at all. I have to admit that I expected the famous Grimnir Shattershield to be just another idiot Nord with only a bit of real power, but the old war veteran impressed me with his creativity and tenacity during our battle so far. I held every advantage against him. My combination of clairvoyance and simple mass of power allowed me to batter his defenses without exerting myself overmuch. The moment he realized his wards were getting cracked with insulting ease, he switched to Terramancy, which, while more magicka-intensive, allowed him to absorb most of my spells, and his enchanted shield allowed him to survive what managed to get through. My clairvoyance told me that the wall was in no real danger of falling, so I decided to take my time with observing the tactics used by the Stormcloak mage. Grimnir, noticing that his situation was not tenable, decided to switch to the offensive, and as he barely held back another spear of fire that cost me basically nothing to cast, he swiftly downed a potion and started running right at me with alteration-enhanced speed. I felt him channel a large amount of magicka, and his shield glowed, creating a layered ward in front of him, all the while his weapon arm shimmered as torrents of ice magic gathered within his grasp. Within what was barely a couple of seconds, he had already cast another large-scale blizzard in my direction, likely hoping to blind me while he engaged in melee. The poor fool. As the spell neared my position, I cast a shadow walk and simply appeared to Grimnir's side, a bolt of fire already leaving my free hand and striking him right in the ribs. I expected the usual result of such a hit, namely him breaking into pieces that did not immediately get disintegrated, but to my great astonishment, all my spell did was take a chunk out of his armor and leave a patch of blackened skin. The old man swerved with skillful ease and immediately launched another spell in my direction, this time a mixture of earthen spikes and telekinetically thrown spikes of steel. I stopped the earth attack, and just to spite him, I rose a wall of thick dirt, utterly invalidating his other attack. I could see frustration grow in the man's eyes as he swiftly drank yet another potion from his large bandolier of vials, a rather potent concoction, judging by his rapidly healing wounds. He seemed to consider something for a moment, costing him yet another painful fireball and a lot of burned hair, and with a deep breath he focused his eyes on me. The next thing I knew, the space to my right cracked, and he was standing right next to me, his hammer in full swing and his mouth open. Recognizing the usual sign of the Thuum being used, I immediately shouted, "Fame!" just in time to avoid the deadly-looking hammer swing, followed by a fully charged blast of unrelenting force. I dashed away from the rebel mage while he refocused and chuckled mockingly. I did not know Ulfric had the guts to teach his underlings how to use the voice. Truly, he shames the very idea of the vaunted greybeards. I could see I'd hit a nerve as the old man glares at me. An elf pissing on our traditions by doing the same has no right to comment on King Ulfric's decisions. Forcing him to dodge with another wave of fire, I shrug as if I were having a simple conversation. I never joined the Order of Greybeards, nor did I desert them like an honorless coward. Something your king has done to the knowledge of all with ears to hear. As if I'd ever listened to your empire-loving slander. King Ugh! I force him to shut up, with a sudden flurry of lightning strikes from both myself and above him, a glancing blow taking off a chunk of his helmet along with the man's ear. Tut tut! I wave my free hand at him like he was a child. Innocent children should not talk back. The mix of pain and humiliation seemingly snaps something within the old man as his entire demeanor shifts to one of cruelty. You speak with such confidence, yet I wonder what you would feel if I told you that while you are here, your precious little domain in Winterhold is falling into our hands at this very moment. I suddenly stop casting spells and stare at the smug fuck while blinking rapidly. A grin spreads on his face when he misunderstands just why I was so stunned and then promptly disappears when I start laughing my ass off. accidentally channeling the Thuum and shaking the ground around me while doing so. Wisely, the old fucker attempts to smack me with his hammer while I am seemingly distracted, but all that earns him is a wide smack to the helmet with the blunt end of my glaive, his life barely saved by an instinctual dodge that turned a decapitation into a glancing blow. Instead of allowing himself to get stunned by my strike, he carries his momentum into another swing while channeling a cloak of ice at the same time, and as if that wasn't enough, the fucker also combines a fuss into his combo. Using my supernatural agility, I duck below the shout and kick out against his hand, redirecting the hammer strike. The ice cloak clashes against my robe's defenses, but doesn't penetrate in time as I counter with my own combination of fire and wind, blasting him back, yet doing frustratingly little damage. Old Man was built like a tank. We stare at each other for a split second, and once again, as if a signal was given, we both strike out with our weapons and magic, our battle turning from a pure clash of magic to one of arms. Grimnir uses both his shield and hammer to force me into being defensive, while I focus on keeping my distance and delivering devastating strikes with my extra range. Seemingly understanding that this is getting him nowhere, the old Nord shifts his position and I feel a different kind of magic flow around him. And within the blink of an eye, I am surrounded by a trio of armored Dremora and a massive white bear. Unlike most lesser Daedra I had faced so far, these fight together and keep pressing me at a constant and uniform pace. All the while Grimnir takes the opportunity to once again potion up and recharge his reserves. This was getting a tad annoying. Time to stop playing around then. I decide, and no longer caring about being efficient, I start blasting everything around me with overcharged Dovazul enhanced spells, banishing the summons and forcing Grimnir to pull away with a click of his tongue. You know what the funniest part is? I ask as we once more enter a stare down. He doesn't seem all that curious, but takes the opportunity to recharge whatever magicka he can and grunts out questioningly. I wouldn't have even known something was happening if not for the little revolt up in Winterhold. I say with a snicker, you lot quite literally warned me of your own plans with that stunt. He blinks slowly as he hears my words, and as the information leaves him, momentarily stunned, I shadow walk right in front of him and make a telegraphed overhead swing with my glaive. Grimnir immediately raises his shield to deflect, but in that moment I let the glaive go from my left hand and summon the ebony blade, the Daedric dagger swiftly finding its way through the old man's armor and into his chest. He recoils with a gasp of pain, his skin looking much paler and his movements greatly slowed down. Yet before I can finish him off, I am forced to duck and teleport away as a flurry of spells comes from behind me, ironically striking the old man but not killing him. The dozen or so Stormcloak magi that survived their brief and likely traumatic meeting with Serana all rush to position themselves in front of me in an attempt to save who I can only guess is their mentor, all of them sporting signs of battle wounds and spell damage. And as if that was not enough, another force of rebels soon emerged from the pass opposite the legionary fort soon after. A downright frightening amount of the elitely equipped force, giving me the feeling of enhanced vitality usually associated with tongues, and over 100 archers positioning themselves atop the large pile of rocks, blocking most of the passage. Yet I do not feel even a bit worried as I stare down the small army slowly emerging to meet me. It was all according to my plan after all. A somewhat healed Grimnir steps out in front of his magi and looks at me with a frown. Are you so arrogant as to still stand before us? I chuckle. Oh no, my good man, not at all. My glaive disappears, and in its place I pull out the staff of Magnus. It is you who are arrogant to stand against me. I offer no further explanation, and just for the sake of being dramatic, I intone, O Magnus, a massive wave of bright blue magicka connected to the eye of the sun flowing out of me in what most would associate with an avalanche. As my grand spell starts to form, all of the magi start bombarding me with spells, and many of the presumed tongues direct their half-baked shouts at me. Yet it is all for naught, as my wards and earthen barriers are powered by the father of magic himself, and the spells of my enemy feel weaker than rain, trying to burrow into steel. The telltale sign of a magicka high tingles into the back of my head as I let out a cackle and let the grand inferno descend upon the force of Stormcloaks. I notice some of the mages rapidly burrowing into the ground where they can, but most of the force is hit head-on. The screams last for but the tiniest instant before all is quiet. With the last bit of magicka left from my ability, I overcharge a shadow step and appear on the wooden walls of the fortified pass. The fires still burning, offering me the perfect view of the now glass-covered valley in front of us. Damn, I am good. General Pov, a bit earlier. Excuse me, ma'am. Serana hears the local quester call her. Yes. She turns to the blood-covered Orsima, none of it his, she notes after some minor observation. Is the court mage going to be all right out there? Zarok asks. I don't want to question his strength, but reports say that the rebels have some pretty strong mages on their own end. The daughter of Cold Harbor cups her chin momentarily before offering the orc the tiniest of shrugs. He doesn't strike me as someone suicidal, so he must have a plan of escape at least. The orc seems unsatisfied with the answer, but seeing as he really can't do much about it, he settles with saying, "Right," and walks off to make sure his men are still ready in case of further attacks. An involuntary shiver suddenly goes down Serana's spine, and she spins toward the ongoing fight just in time to feel the massive amount of magicka roil from her current ally. The sight that greets her eyes makes the millennia-old woman gape in sheer astonishment as the Dunmer mage summons a literal sun atop the rebel forces, quite literally baking their entire position and turning the entire surface into fragile glass. She blinks a couple of times, forcing her eyes to readjust to the sudden lack of light before a hatefully hopeful thought appears in her mind. Maybe he really can face my father. She takes a drink of her blood potion, utterly disgusted at her own optimism, though she fails to remove the small feeling of hope in her heart. Chapter 212. Trust. Raven's POV. My internal celebration ends as swiftly as it began as I feel a sudden lack of power. Whatever magicka high-induced bender I was about to indulge in was ruined utterly by the sudden feeling of being metaphorically splashed by a barrel of freezing water. Feeling one's veins bursting with power only for them to suddenly feel completely empty was not a sensation I would ever enjoy, but the massive power spike made it all worth it. So it was just another thing I would add to the list I dislike doing, but still must do. The same place talking to nobility is now that I think on it. The tiny fact I had magic drugs on hand to help me deal with all of this childish cough rambling was just a happy little coincidence, of course. One lit stick of whatever the fuck Hakan had cooked up back in Winterhold later, and I was feeling much better than a couple of seconds back. The equivalent of magical dehydration swiftly squashed by the influx of new power. Naturally, I was not left alone long enough to enjoy it as the sound of armored boots rushing, though not running, toward me drew my attention. Soon enough, Zarok stepped out of a nearby tower, followed distantly by a curious Serana. The orc saluted. "Sir, do you require assistance?" His eyes were filled with a mix of dread and awe, with a small undertone of worry. Unsummoning my crown and noticing a couple of the legionaries around me visibly relax, I raised an eyebrow. "No, I think that I will be fine with just a bit of rest." The orc blinks in surprise but swiftly hides it. "If that is what you believe, sir, cheeky fucker couldn't stop himself from questioning me after all. Do you want the after-battle report?" I sigh tiredly before waving for him to get on with it. He nods and starts talking, the long and short of it being that we lost another 23 soldiers to the enemy, while 3 of the tower-mounted scorpions were heavily damaged in the night raid. Enemy losses were estimated to be at around 150 at the wall itself, and an additional 300 in the field of glass, as I now privately called it. All in all, a successful and productive evening, I voice with only a hint of mockery, much to the chagrin of the nearby legionaries. Without a care for their perceived offense, I got up and started walking toward the camp. Come on then, we might as well celebrate our success. Not like the dumbasses will dare attack again after all that. I say the final part a lot more quietly, but it is loud enough to reassure some of the soldiers around me. Then, feeling like a complete dumbass, I stop and ask, "Any wounded in need of healing?" A couple of dozen healed wounds later, I was sitting in front of a large bonfire, the legionaries enjoying some food and drink from my personal stock, a small reward for their admittedly impressive performance during this short siege. The fact that they looked at me like I was an angel, descended from the heavens, when I summoned an entire barrel of premium black briar was also a nice bonus. It might seem foolish for me to give them drinks, but I had good reason to believe the siege to be over, as we were about to get reinforcements, while the enemy had lost a massive amount of their local veteran forces. Such losses no doubt crushed morale among their greener troops, and not even the Stormcloaks were dumb enough to throw boys into the meat grinder that is the fortified pass. Simply put, I had just bought the Legion weeks of unmolested operation within Falkreath hold. Much more than enough for me to make a big move without the Stormcloaks being able to do a thing about it. Thinking about the war, I hear Serana ask quietly enough not to be heard by anyone but myself. Zarok had discreetly given me a report on her performance during the battle, and it seemed that she simply settled on battling the enemy magi, not showing even a hint of her vampiric powers, either magical or physical. The men were all in all grateful for her presence, seeing as she was under no obligation to help them, and still did. Funnily enough, no one bothered asking her name or anything about her for that matter. The soldiers knew to keep their noses out of the business of nobles, and Serana looked like the quintessential noble. I shrug. A rather obvious conclusion. I have to capitalize on this massive victory, or all we have done would be some relatively minor casualties. Seemingly losing interest in the small talk, she jumps straight to the real reason she is talking to me. I knew you were powerful, but that spell... I give her a blank look and ask with a hint of mockery, did Magi in your time openly advertise their full power? She gives me one in turn, don't pretend to be an idiot, it does not suit you. Why thank you? I promptly pretend to be an idiot for but a moment before Serana's lack of amusement threatens to have her throw something at me. As for the question you refuse to actually ask, I helpfully point out, much to her annoyance, I am in cahoots with many a higher power, something which arms me for the challenges ahead. She stares at me for a while, waiting for me to elaborate, but when I don't, she shrugs. I am not getting more than that, am I? She asks rhetorically, before lightly sighing, very well, I have another question, however. Ask, I mutter, my voice lacking much interest. If you were so powerful, why go through all the trouble of convincing me to help you and the fledgling group of vampire hunters if you can simply overpower most of Castle Volkihar's warriors with a single spell? Her cold tone gives the impression of judgment, but I had talked to her enough to recognize it as mere curiosity. I huff. Only a fool relies on simple power to solve his problems. And besides, much like I have my own secrets, so too does your dear father. Her gaze turns contemplative, but I am not finished. And this might come as a surprise to you considering your upbringing, but when your allies trust you and actually want to help you, instead of being coerced into it, they tend to not do something as idiotic as withholding information or, the whole betrayal thing. She frowns as if this was the first time she had heard something like this. Things did not work like that in the castle. Your castle really shouldn't be taken as an example in most things social or functional, no offense. I immediately fire back. None taken. She shrugs, obviously agreeing with my assessment. I simply say that trusting someone is not something done easily, especially when one is raised by Balites. You do not count yourself among them after all? I quirk an eyebrow. The look of sheer and utter disgust, completely overpowering her general lack of expression, is all the answer I need for that question. Good. I offer praise instead of apology, and while I know my words won't be of much help, living without being able to truly trust someone sounds like a far more cursed existence than merely being irritated by the sun. That is easily said, Serana mutters, though she doesn't outright deny my statement. I cup my chin momentarily. If you are unable to convince yourself to feel something, then just follow the process of elimination. I've had every opportunity to either destroy you or force you into servitude, yet I have done none of these things. That is usually where trust begins. She gives me a sideways glance, yet you still ask me to help you against my father. I shrug, because I know that you know it is the right decision. She stills suddenly before sighing, are you this frustratingly perceptive with all of your allies? Only the interesting ones, I quip. Now enough with all the serious stuff. What can you tell me about hemomancy? Even with the sweet temptation that was high-quality mead, the legionaries kept to discipline and only indulged to a limited extent. Zarok keeping everyone at least partial attention and still setting up a proper guard rotation. Unnecessary with me present, but I would not have them grow careless just to satisfy my ego. And much like I expected, no further movement came from the Stormcloaks, save for some magical fluctuations below the glassed ground, which was most likely the surviving mages teleporting out when they realized there was no help coming. I sent Scorch out to scout the enemy army in the rift, and dear Dagoth were we lucky that the pass was so narrow. There had to be at least 3,000 of the fuckers on the other side, and even with their sudden disorder at witnessing a literal sun appear atop their forces, but half a day prior I would still need at least 2,000 men supporting me to do any real damage. Something that was swiftly confirmed when Scorch's memories ended with a massive barrage of ice shards the moment he was spotted. By noon of the following day, our reinforcements had finally arrived, about 500 men wearing Whiterun colours, the banner of the stallion hanging proudly above the formation of horsemen and heavy infantry. The legionaries tensed as the force of Nords approached. Even with their victory and celebration, they were all still very tired and paranoid due to the deaths of many of their friends and comrades. I naturally cared not for such things and stepped out to meet the men of Whiterun. Swiftly recognizing the two men leading them, I rose my hand in greeting, "Ho there, Greymane and Battleborn." Adar Greymane squinted at my approach. "Let me guess, Flametongue, you already had all the fun without us." Ungrim Battleborn rolls his eyes at his friend's words, as if a bunch of sweaty Windhelm cuckolds would succeed where a Daedric prince did not. The duo of Whiterun housecarls guffaw at the man's joke, while I look at them with amusement. I am afraid that I did in fact take all of the fun. You get to sit your asses down while whatever remains of the legionary garrison goes for some paid leave. Surprisingly, it is Zarok that speaks up. "Sir, with all due respect, we can't leave." I look at him with a smile that was most assuredly not a smile and ask, "I am sorry, Kester, but did I stutter?" The orc shivers at my tone and looks away. "No, sir." I thought as much. My smile widens fractionally, looking all the more terrifying. "You lot have earned some rest, and you will need to be properly reinforced and re-equipped. If you thought I wasn't going to reward you lot for surviving that, then I would be rather insulted." Zarok stares at me unblinkingly while his brain resets. "I do believe this is where you thank me," I drawl with great amusement. He snaps at attention as his mind finally reboots. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Right then. I turn back to the duo of Whiterun housecarls. "You two can take your time setting things up as the rebels won't be moving about for some time at least, but I need another thing from you before you do." Adar raises an eyebrow. "What do you need, lad?" Many a legionnaire gawks at his term of address, but seeing as I ignore it, no one speaks up. "I need a map Imperial operations within Falkreath, as well as the position of the command center." I rub my hands while my smile turns slightly feral. I have a city to conquer after all. Chapter 213, Tiberius. General POV. Second Squad head off the Western assault. An imposingly tall Imperial, wearing an opulent red and gold combination of a mage's robe and a legionary officer's armor, orders a unit of equally imposing heavy legionaries, all of them larger than the average orc. The soldiers, or at least what the rebel rangers believe them to be, immediately follow the Imperial's orders and smash into the group of Stormcloaks, trying to set fire to the valuable supply train their enemy was guarding. A stray arrow ricochets off the Imperial's helm, making him flinch back violently. The young man grunts in annoyance before reaffirming his foe confidence and giving his next order, "Squad 1, dispose of the archers." A unit of suspiciously short legionaries with even more suspiciously red ears let out a series of gleeful cackles as they start bombarding the patch of forest housing, the rangers with firebolts, and in some cases even fireballs. The cackles intensify as the screams of their targets reach their crooked ears. Much to the young man's chagrin, the fiery bombardment only serves to embolden the rebels as more and more arrows start pelting his glorious army from every direction. The legionary engineers he was tasked with protecting remaining blessedly out of the line of fire while his own units took the damage head-on. He had 6 squads at his disposal, 4 infantry and 2 mage, But it was seemingly not enough, as his soldiers started to fall one by one to either arrow fire or a surprise assault by light cavalry. How the rebels managed to maneuver cavalry in the thick forest baffled the mind, but he had other things to worry about at the moment, as they had seemingly grown impatient with simply trying to shoot him down and sent out their infantry contingent. His soldiers fought valiantly, taking 2 rebels for each of them that fell, yet it was a losing battle, a fact growing more evident with each passing moment. His favored aide, a rather pretty thing he had near him at all times due to no hormonal reason whatsoever, had fallen taking an arrow for him when the rebels finally realized that their enemies were disappearing the moment they were killed and were evidently summons and not mortals. He had hoped against hope that the dumb Nord stereotype would save him, but it turned out that Nords were in fact not idiots, as evidenced by the barrage of arrows he was barely avoiding. He spent every moment not occupied with avoiding a swift and painful death, lamenting his constant refusal to practice defensive magic when he was still at the college. Truly, if one of his colleagues saw him now, they would probably wring his neck for his slothfulness. A cold shiver went down his spine the moment the thought entered his mind. One by one, all 30 of his glorious soldiers finally fell, the young man surviving by the skin of his teeth and via copious usage of combat scrolls. A lesson taught to him by his father: if a problem could not be solved by skill, it could be solved by throwing money at it. Something many a rebel learned to the point of fatality when they were burned by a sudden fireball. Yet for all his fortune, fate had seemingly caught up with him when a furious rebel slammed his metal shield into his armored head, knocking him on the ground and lifting his axe with a snarl, intending to end the young man for all of his slain comrades. Many things happened within the blink of an eye. Human-shaped shadows started emerging from behind the rebels, cutting them down like grass or cooking them in their armor with lightning. The least lucky among the Stormcloaks screamed in abject agony as they were devoured alive by a swarm of minuscule frostbite spiders. Before Tiberius Gracchus could even understand what was happening, the rebel in front of him was engulfed by a blast of bright crimson and was gone, only his boots standing as evidence he even existed in the first place. Sound returned to Tiberius's ears as he finally left his blunt force trauma-induced daze, and he heard magical explosions happening all around him, and before he could further contemplate his situation, he felt someone kick him in the leg, drawing his attention. Bright red eyes met his own as the armored figure called out to him, "Wake the fuck up, Legionnaire, we have rebels to burn." Now that he could do. Raven's POV. Please. An annoying rasp reaches my ears, drawing my attention to a fallen enemy ranger lacking many of his limbs, trying his best to survive by crawling away. No. I snap my fingers, and one red flash later, there is no ranger crawling anywhere. A moment later, Scorch lands on my shoulder and chirps, "That is the last of them, Pops." One mental check later, and I nod. Yup, poor fuckers didn't even have a proper retreat path. The glorious bird boy shrugs. What did you expect? My faith in humanity shall forever be the source of infinite disappointment, I know. I falsely lament as I approach the legionary supply train and Tiberius's slowly replenishing ranks of Dremora. Said tall imperial mage notices me as soon as I near him and poisons my eyes with a flamboyant bow. My many thanks for your timely assistance, good sir. I am glad that another loyal subject— Oh, for fuck's sake, Tiberius, can you not stop preaching for one fucking second? I cut him off with an eye roll, unsummoning my helm in the process. He blinks dumbly for a moment before muttering, "Raven?" The moment the words leave his mouth, he reflexively salutes me, but I stop him with a raised hand. No need for that when not on official business. I chuckle at his never-ending enthusiasm. You lot heading to the siege camp? Indeed, he nods. The siege engines were damaged due to the constant raiding, and this caravan was tasked with bringing in replacement parts. See, if you studied alteration properly, you'd just be able to replace all that. I immediately start to lambast his laziness, an old college tradition from when we were still weak little apprentices, and why am I seeing no other legionaries present? He scratches his cheek while trying desperately to look at anywhere else but at me. Well, I kind of volunteered to do the guarding on my own. No words were needed as I looked at him with sheer, unfiltered disappointment. I am not stupid. I had my own soldiers with me, he justifies weakly. I simply raise an eyebrow at his reasoning. We both knew that Dremora could be banished with specialized weapons or scrolls, even spells of a certain level. His shoulders slump. We were losing dozens of men to the constant ambushes, and I wanted to stop any more from dying. My disappointment disappears as if it was never there. Finally, a hint of truth. He removes his helmet and lets out a chuckle. I forgot how uncaring you are for the feelings of others. Only when they are as fragile as your own, I quip back. He shakes his head and starts resummoning his minions one by one. Most of them were as I expected them to be, Scamps and Dremora humoring their contractor by wearing Legion armor. Though the last one he summons makes me do a double take. Tiberius, please don't tell me you are using a handmaiden of Azura in your little toy soldier project. He looks away and whistles innocently. Oof, 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 said handmaiden giggles into her hand. Do not worry, my lord. Dear Tiberius is most chivalrous in the way he treats us. The man looks away with a light blush at this comment. I deadpan at her. Are all female-looking Daedra like this? She tilts her head. Whatever could you mean by that, my lord? She sounds confused, but her entire body language is as seductive as can be, without being outright whorish. I scratch my chin thoughtfully. Honestly, that is pretty embarrassing. She flinches as if struck. What? Oh, nothing. I raise a placating hand. I've just had Mafala try and get into my pants so many times at this point that your attempts were the same as those of a child. My voice is kind, but my eyes radiate mockery. The handmaiden's eye twitches, and she almost yells out in frustration. Yes? Well, she tries to get into everyone's pants, so there. My patron's amused giggle resounds in the back of my head, and I hear her say, Oh, I like her, causing a vicious smirk to spread on my face. Why are you looking at me like that? She asks with narrowed eyes. Oh, nothing. It is just that if I were you, I'd do my best to remain summoned for as long as possible. I tell her with a lazy wave. Seemingly understanding what just happened, she pales and tries to hide behind Tiberius while shivering. Do I even want to know? Tiberius asks cautiously. I raise an eyebrow. I don't know, do you? Apparently even he has a sense of self-preservation as he resolutely shakes his head. We continue helping out the rattled and grumbling engineers for a while longer, and after we were finally joined by Serana, who had been hunting escaping rebels. Reed, drinking the poor fuckers I allowed to escape for this exact purpose, we headed toward the siege camp. Naturally, I couldn't stop myself from asking the tall man, So Tiberius, care to tell me why you were not using proper defensive alteration in that battle? His gulp and sudden paleness told me far more than I needed to lambast him the entire walk toward the camp, much to the entertainment of the engineers following us. We arrived at the siege camp and by extension Falkreath itself by the day's evening without any further incident. My appearance caused something of a commotion, but all doubts were swiftly gone as the engineers arrived behind us, a round of loud cheers breaking out amongst battle-weary legionaries. The siege camp was built to the usual Legion standard, but scaled up for maximum effectiveness. A trio of palisades surrounded the center of the camp, with each wall being slightly taller the further in they were placed. A series of trenches surrounded the camp and were progressively dug outward as if to surround the city itself. Actually, surrounding the damn place would probably take months and would not be worth the trouble, as the trenches were mostly used to counter raids, and the actual encirclement of the city was done by cavalry and light infantry, tasked with delaying any sortie, while reinforcements were dispatched from the legionary base southwest of Falkreath. Speaking of the city, it was as things usually were in this world, far larger than I remembered. Large longhouses surrounding the tall stone and wood keep in the city's center and the vast marketplace surrounding it. The walls were mostly made of stone, but there was a spot or three where they were rapidly patched up, using hardwood of some kind due to the constant bombardment by siege weapons. Speaking of woods, the tree line was far closer to the city walls than I remember it being at Riften, with only the closest trees cut down as to not make the walls completely and utterly useless. I do hope the place wasn't infested with some kind of tree-hugger cult, or I swear to Dagoth I will throw a fit. And then there was the graveyard, a rather dreary thing for a city to be known for, but Falkreath was most assuredly not known for its hospitality, so a graveyard it is. The whole thing stretched out south of the city, taking up almost as much space as the city itself, with everything from dirt graves to mausoleums, dotted around almost haphazardly, yet still somehow looking peaceful and reverent, all of it surrounding a vast church of arcade. I absently noticed a trio of priests going on about their business without a single care directed toward the siege. No one was stupid enough to offend half the province by targeting the graveyard after all. I was forced to cease with my observations as we finally reached the walled command tent, an entire century of legionary elites dutifully guarding their general's position. Serana. I speak up as Tiberius goes through the tedium of identifying us to the guards. Yes? She tilts her head. You might wish to sit this one out. I say lightly as the guards finally start eyeing me with a mix of suspicion and awe. That is unless you wish to be entangled with current-day politics. Call me when you need me, she says with surprising swiftness and moves to rest in the nearby shade. With a light chuckle, I walk on toward a somewhat confused Tiberius. Your lady friend not a fan of big meetings? He asks conversationally. She just doesn't need to get involved more than she already has. I wave off his question and start walking toward the general's tent, the guards parting before us without any complaint. The first thought that enters my mind as we walk into the tent is, damn, that is as Spartan as can be without looking poor. The second is, didn't know Ricker was involved in all this. General. Tiberius offers the middle-aged Imperial a crisp salute. General Tullius, Riker. I offer them both a nod of greeting. The legate simply nods back, but Tullius gives me a deeply scrutinizing once-over before finally speaking, Court Mage, we were not expecting you during this campaign. Deciding to, for once, not dance around the question, I offer my signature smirk, and I wasn't going to join until I got my hands on some very interesting news about an attack on Helgen's Pass. All weariness disappears from the Imperial General as he straightens up and barely holds himself back from commanding me and instead asks, would you kindly give us your report? But of course, General, I wouldn't be wasting my time here otherwise. And so began the meeting that would lead to Falkreath's fall into the hands of the Empire. Chapter 214, Tullius. You blew up the entire assault force with a single spell. General Tullius deadpans at me when I finish explaining the battle at the pass. The veteran commander so often portrayed as unflappable and serious was seemingly having trouble holding back his sheer incredulity. Indeed I did. I nod proudly, completely ignoring the fact I ended hundreds of lives in a short moment. I also found out that a sufficiently potent fire spell turns the ground to glass upon detonation. I explain enthusiastically to the mildly disturbed officer. You learn something new every day. Moving on, Tullius gives me a pointed look while Tiberius stares at me as if I grew a second head. Ricker remains unmoved, however. She had learned to expect insanity from me and wasn't about to bother with entertaining me with a reaction. Right. I nod. After the battle, I sent out my familiar to gather information and found out that there was an army of approximately 3,000 warriors waiting on the other end. Though I wouldn't worry about them attacking again anytime soon, as their morale was thoroughly shaken by my work. The general starts flipping through a bunch of scout reports and mutters, we had no idea the rebels were moving in such force. He frowns deeply. Our scouts failed to inform us of any enemy movement beyond the border. They, in fact, assured us that they noticed no force larger than a garrison moving about, which is the only reason I saw fit to redirect some forces toward Falkreath. Probably because they were trying to infiltrate the rift. I explain easily, while the local forces are not so skilled as to be able to hide an entire army, taking out a bunch of scouts or just plain misdirecting them is definitely within the skill set of some of the locals, especially when you count in the massive mountain standing in the way of any communication. And I have no doubts that Ulfric has done his best to recruit as many of the more talented agents to his cause as possible. I tilt my head in remembrance. Well, those that my own allies in the hold failed to recruit at the very least. Looks like Maven will be on the receiving end of some choice words when I am done here. The legionary general pulls out a personal journal and starts making notes on the eastern hold. I have heard that Riften is a cesspool, but there was little tell of skilled agents among their number. Which is kind of the point, I quip. His upper lip twitches, either due to frustration with himself or with my irreverence, possibly both. Deciding to skip the potential pissing match, I speak again. Still, I'd recommend informing yourself about each and every hold while you are here, potentially even each settlement, as every one of them has their own strengths and weaknesses, and underestimating them or taking them for granted will only lead to a waste of men. That and Nords do not appreciate their traditions getting snubbed, even the minor ones. Riker gives Tullius an amused glance, and the general, visibly holding back his annoyance with the prodding he had no doubt already received from his subordinate, chooses to change the topic in any case. He gives us both a pointed look. The Legion thanks you for your assistance in dealing with a potential disaster. The appropriate authorities will be informed of your deeds. Much obliged. I offer him a lazy nod, and then with a bit more energy, I clap my hands, and with that out of the way, maybe we should finally get to the real reason I am here. Some enthusiasm finally returns to the general as leans on the large table standing in front of him. Yes, if I am reading the situation correctly, you wish to aid us in the taking of the city, now that you have done sufficient damage to head off potential Magi intervention. Indeed. I approach the aforementioned table housing a highly detailed map of Falkreath's hold and indicate a paved road leading from the Pale Pass all the way to Solitude. Falkreath is by far the most important land supply route from Cyrodiil to the loyal parts of Skyrim, and conquering it as fast as possible is a top priority, and I am here to make sure it happens without catastrophic losses on our side. The general nodded his assent immediately. That is why we have been pushing this front with such vigor in the first place. He looks up at me with an appraising eye. I am told you played a part in making this strategy. It was nothing complicated, so do not expect me to be some kind of hidden strategic genius. I immediately wave him off. I know the basics, but anyone with true skill would likely outmaneuver me without much difficulty. Much to the surprise of his two subordinates, Tullius lets out a quiet chuckle. To think I'd meet a mage who doesn't think they know best. He shakes his head, and his amusement with it. Do not let that false humility blind you to a potential talent, however, no matter how unlikely it is that you may have it. Instead of debating him, I simply shrug. Something has to differentiate the truly powerful from the merely competent. Knowledge of the self being rather high on that ladder. Now, what can you tell me about the enemy forces? Instead of telling me, he pulls out a stack of parchment and offers it to me. One clairvoyance-assisted speed read later, I looked back up to the trio of Legion officers who were currently discussing the continued siege bombardment of the city. Tullius was the first to notice me, and after signaling the two others to wait, he greets me with a raised eyebrow. I trust you are sufficiently informed. I am indeed. I nod and return the notes. The situation is fairly favorable for us if one discounts the rebels' home field advantage. I surmise non-committedly. And that was the truth of the matter. We had something close to 7,000 men, mostly from Solitude and Whiterun, and some from Cyrodiil, while the enemy had only about 3,000 warriors, with another 3,000 militiamen of different kinds to support them. All in all, a relatively equivalent force when the rebels' defences are added into the equation. I also learned that Tullius had brought only 3,000 legionaries with him from Cyrodiil. A bit frustrating, but I could understand wanting to keep watch on the Thalmor while Torrig mopped up his own lands with minimal help. At least he had the foresight to bring specialist units like the engineers I met earlier. The legionary force he brought with him consisted of 6 cohorts, specifically 1 of engineers, 2 of artillery, 1 cohort of spellswords, another of elite light cavalry, and finally a unit of elite heavy infantry to help train the local recruits. A well-rounded composition considering his intentions and role in the war. Why summon up a bunch of infantry if the local forces were enough to fully cover the front line and you had the ability to instead cover their weaknesses? The unit of elite rangers is also an issue, I add after a moment, referring to another piece of information I got from Tullius's notes. While I doubt they would be able to defeat me, having a unit of over 100 elite archers shooting enchanted arrows at me would be rather problematic in the case of an assault. The enemy has been holding them in reserve for the most part. Tullius adds, the only instant in which they were deployed is when we tried having Tiberius here harass the tower guards with his summons. I can practically feel the man's disdain for the Dremora, but he hides it well under the guise of professionalism. Wise of them, I say with some approval, and a perfect chance for us to demoralize them. All 6 eyes move to me as I offer them a vicious grin, for you see, my dear comrades, I have come up with a cunning plan. Tullius raises an eyebrow, Ricker deadpans, and Tiberius shivers. General POV, the following morning. The defenders of Falkreath rose from their slumber, and as they have done for weeks prior, many went to relieve their comrades unfortunate enough to be assigned to the night guard. An armored Nord woman climbed up one of the gatehouse towers to the southwest of the city. It was known to be the most dangerous part of the wall, as it faced the camp of the filthy Imperials directly and was thus placed under most of the enemy's artillery fire. Her eyes met with a tired comrade of hers who rose a hand in greeting. "Ho there, Anna, already morning?" the man asked groggily. Before she could answer, her eyes were drawn toward an odd sight. A lone legionary officer walking toward the walls with determination and a complete lack of fear. Recognizing the summoner that brought no end of frustration to the defenders, Anna immediately rushed to call the marksman. Maybe they would finally be rid of the damn heathen. Tiberius's POV. Fuck, 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 fuck. Raven's POV. And you are quite certain I did not just send a promising officer to his death? Tullius asks tersely. Ever since I had voiced my idea, he had been giving me odd looks I couldn't quite place. Relax, General. I wave off his concerns, visibly far too relaxed for the situation at hand, something which annoyed the General fiercely. Worst case, I will just run out there and retrieve him. And what if he is killed instantly? Tullius asks, evidently still not all that content with simply watching things unfold. He has enough cannon fodder to survive, I say flippantly, earning another odd look from the middle-aged Imperial. Oh, come on now, who am I offending? The fucking Daedra. Apparently getting enough of my shit, the General turns to his legate and starts asking for his daily reports from the scouts and quartermasters, leaving me to my devices. The fingers of my left hand move in practiced patters as the glaive in my right glows a dangerous red. An extremely complex spell circle slowly forming in front of me, and my anticipation growing by the minute. Rebel POV. It took the dozen or so marksmen assigned to the southwestern section of the wall less than half a minute to arrive. All of them took positions and swiftly aimed at their target, who was suddenly surrounded by a group of 30 armored Dremora. But before even one of them could loose a single arrow, a bright flash of crimson light appeared within the deed center of the enemy camp, and within the blink of an eye, a fork of bring red lightning smacked right into the heads of each and every one of the marksmen, precisely powered in such a way as to splatter their brains all over their allies. One of the more sharp-eyed among them seemingly noticed something in the enemy camp and swiftly hid behind the thickest stone wall he could find. "Ulfa, what is going on?" Anna yelled from her own covered position. The man seemed just about ready to start hyperventilating, but the question brought some focus to him, and he managed to gasp out, Flame-to tongue is here." A wave of despair spread among the stormcloaked troops atop the wall, and like an avalanche continued through the entire city. And then the Dremora started bombarding the gate with fireballs. Raven's POV. "And bullseye," I exclaimed cheerfully, the charred cracks spreading atop the walls and towers, bringing a sadistic smirk to my face. "I see your boasts were not empty." Tullius comments from beside me, "A couple more raids like this one, followed by a fire attack, and their morale will be broken enough for an easy assault." He easily surmises my entire plan. That was the point, yes. I nod. My presence alone is enough to scare them shitless, apparently. Immediately understanding the source of my certainty, he mutters, "Ah yes, you're—" He trails off uncomfortably. Third Eye General, no need to dance around the subject. I look at him with some amusement. "I do know you were at least somewhat friendly with my father." He nods with a hint of sadness in his eyes and mutters, "Yes, he was." "A dear comrade." "That you lot betrayed," I quip, but before he can defend himself I raise a hand. "It matters very little right now. I am not my father, nor were you obligated to do something stupid for a dead man." The general offers a stiff nod and looks ready to change the topic, but movement from the enemy makes me stop him in his tracks. "It seems that some of the fools are braver than we believed. A bunch of cavalrymen are about to rush Tiberius." I do not wait for him to comment and start cooking up another long-range spell. He looks at me for a brief moment and nods. "I see you have things well in hand. I will leave you to it." "Have no fear, General. They are all within my grasp," I say ominously as I am surrounded by the crimson glow of my spell. Chapter 215, Fall of Falkreath, Part 1. In essence, the only reason that the Absorb life spell even works for vampires at all is the malleability of our own life force, considering we use it more as fuel than it being what keeps us alive in the first place. Serana patiently answers my idle question as we sit in one of the larger tents near the General's own. She considers for a moment and continues, "In truth, vampires are not truly immortal in the first place, as we do need to steal the life force of others to fuel our own existence. Our condition is what makes the process efficient enough to keep us relatively ageless." "I see," I mutter as I gaze over the still slightly burning walls of Falkreath. "So if I were to theoretically use the spell, I would either get absolutely nothing from it, get some minor healing, or somehow contaminate my own life force in the process. Did I get that right?" "Essentially." Serana nods. "My mother did many experiments with how the entire process worked, and this is the conclusion that she came to after decades of work. Decades that spelled the doom of hundreds of thralls, no doubt." I chuckle darkly. The vampire looks away uncomfortably. "They were dead the moment they got caught." "Ah, yes, because that makes it all right." I snort, and before she can retort, I shake my head. "No matter. We both know how immoral the practices of your clan are, so there really isn't any more point for me to pour out my vitriol any further." "Then why did you?" She snaps back quietly. I sigh. I am bored. The blank look she gives me before returning to her book makes me snicker childishly before I too return to my own reading. Savos' own notes on transposition was the choice for the evening. Teleportation was neat, and relying on inefficient shadow movement would prove problematic at some point, so I might as well put the work in while I have the free time. The excitement at possibly advancing the spell to the point of breaching the veil of reality was all the motivation I needed to go through the tome's worth of calculations and formulae crammed into the comparatively small book in barely legible chicken scratch. I swear the old fart must have marked the book somehow, so he knew exactly when I opened it and is laughing his arse off right about now. "We will see how you laugh when I spike your food with laxatives, you ancient sweet." Time flew as I delved into the barely legible writing, even though he could use some exercise with his quill work. The Archmage knew his shit, and the way in which he explained concepts I would have trouble understanding with days of work definitely reduced the amount of extra spice that would end up in his food. Sadly, all good things must come to an end, as one of the legionary bodyguards rapped his knuckles on the wooden post in front of my tent, thus drawing all my attention from my book. "Yes?" I ask, only mildly annoyed. "General Tullius has called for a meeting, sir." The soldier reports dutifully. My lips thin, but I do get up. "Very well, I will be there shortly." The man salutes and walks off. Before I leave, I turn to Serana. I am getting the feeling that things are about to get exciting. "Do you wish to participate?" "Do you need me to?" she asks, her lack of interest in participating obvious to even the blind. "Nope." "Then I will stay here and finish my book," she says, and without even waiting for me to respond, returns to reading another large history book. This time it was one on Talos's unification of the continent. I leave the knowledge-hungry vampire to her work and make my way toward the command tent. Tullius had made sure I would be nearby and ordered an entire unit of elites to move out of the way so they could house me properly. The favoritism was incredibly obvious, but I had the rights to certain privileges by being what I am, and I saw no reason to be falsely humble with these things. That would just lose me respect among both the nobles and the troops. The command tent was filled to the absolute brim with all manner of imperial officers, Everyone from Quaestor to Legate was present, except for those that still needed to keep watch. I noticed a rather tired Tiberius chatting with Legate Ricker in one of the tent's corners, while General Tullius ever so dutifully went over the morning's scout reports. The moment I entered, the general looked up and greeted me, Court Mage. "General." I nodded back at him. "I am guessing it is time." "Indeed." Tullius waved his hand over a couple of spread-out reports. "After 3 days of constant harassment, the rebels are getting panicked and unruly. Waiting any longer would let them reorganize and harden their resolve, so the assault will commence today. We are looking to end it all swiftly." I state more than ask. "Yes," the general says firmly, causing quite a few of the officers to straighten up with pride and resolve. "We will take the city in one fell swoop and utterly crush any resistance with our sheer combined might. Don't have to chase insurgents around if all of them are too scared to rebel in the first place, eh?" I ask jokingly. "Indeed." The general's lip twitches slightly, almost forming into a smirk, "which is why I will need you to provide some showmanship." The cruel smile on my face sent shivers down the spines of the less experienced officers. "Why, General, you needn't even have asked." Just as the morning fog lifted, thousands of legionnaires marched out from the siege camp, while the siege ballistae bombarded the different sections of the wall. I walked in front of the formation, Tiberius and his posse in lockstep behind me, the thundering of armored feet bringing an old tune to my mind, and I started quietly whistling as we marched. Something about a bunch of grenadiers, coated in red if I remember right. We did not even bother rising shields or watching the walls for enemy archers. Let us just say that after 3 entire days of being covered by their friends' innards, the rebels of Falkreath had been thoroughly educated about my capability to bring death at range. In short, they knew better. We stopped some 20 or so meters in front of the large wooden city gate, the legionaries marching behind me, growing deathly quiet as I continued walking forward. "Now then, how did Tolfdir do this?" I mutter to the empty air before smirking and stomping the ground with all my might. Rebel POV. "Form up, you maggots," the Stormcloak housecarl snarls at the warriors swiftly gathering into a shieldal wall in front of the city gate. "The dogs of the Empire will soon be upon us, and I will not have you shame King Ulfric with your cowardice." Some in the rear ranks mutter expletives, but the housecarl had earned a reputation for harsh punishment, so most keep their mouths shut as he keeps yelling out insult after insult. Though he did not do it without purpose, the war veteran currently busying himself with enraging his own men knew that they were utterly terrified by the events of the past couple of days, and he was doing his damnedest to turn that fear into something a tad more productive. He did not have time for much more after all. He kept going for minute after minute, his throat growing coarse with all the yelling, and just as he was finally about to be content with the furious glares his men were sending him, he heard a loud crunch from the gate. The crack spreading across its entire surface told him enough. He stood before his men, his back turned to them, and raised his blade and shield. "Hear me, sons and daughters of Skyrim. Whatever comes through that gate, you will stand your ground." The moment he finished speaking, whatever weapon the Legion was using smashed into the gate once again. The rebels prepared to be assaulted by some kind of Dwemer abomination, or even a Daedra. The sight that greeted them may as well have been worse. King Torrig's court mage stood before them, a sword in one hand and dagger in the other, and his mere presence sent shivers down the rebels' spines, sparing not even the housecarl. And then the mage charged, Tiberius's POV. I raise my short sword upwards and command my men, "Forward for the Empire." We all rush in after Raven, our speed barely enough to stop him from getting utterly surrounded and just enough to give us full view of the sheer butchery he was committing. Whenever his dagger stabbed, the target would shrivel up like all water was painfully dragged out of them, and wherever his sword met flesh, the wounds would spread like spiderweb-shaped cracks, almost always ending a life with a mere touch. I focus back on my own fight just in time to see one of our ranks getting pushed. With a flick of my hand, a group of my soldiers appears in the weakened formation, pushing the rebels back. A troop of archers forms up atop a roof behind us as we manage to push the enemy formation back, I swiftly have my own magi cover them in flames. My mind slowly grows numb as the slaughter continues and the deathly march of the Emperor's legion continues ever onwards. General POV. Atop one of the taller noble manors in Falkreath, the remaining band of the Hold's elite marksmen gathered. Their resolve was made firm by days of watching their friends die pointlessly, and all 12 of them found their target the moment he bloodily smashed through their comrades' line in the city's central square. They took their positions and prepared their most potent arrows, all of them coated in vicious mana burn imported from Black Marsh. They waited for but a moment, and then as one, loosed their arrows at the vile sorcerer butchering their men. The elf did not even look at them, nor did he make any indication of noticing them. He merely stopped moving for a split second, allowing the arrows to sink into Stormcloak flesh, and then continued weaving through the sea of corpses of his own creation. "The bee bastard can see us." One of the younger marksmen sputtered and snarled at once. "Calm yourself, Eric." An older veteran snapped at him. "Come now, brothers, once again," he commanded, even though deep down he already understood how pointless it was. They never got to draw their bows. A massive flaming bird appeared from seemingly nowhere, swiftly taking off the heads of 2 of the marksmen and setting another 4 on fire with brilliant golden flames. Before they even managed to turn, another got his throat pecked out, while 3 more were burned in the ever-expanding flames. Eric drew an arrow with shaky hands, barely managing to place it atop his longbow, just in time to watch the demon bird peck out the old veteran's eyes out in 2 swift bobs of its vile burning head. "Am I getting an eye fetish?" Eric was utterly stunned to hear the bird speak with a pure and cheerful voice. The burning eyes turned to him as blood evaporated from the gigantic hawk. "Don't answer that," the bird commanded. All Eric could do before his death was curse his father for making him join the rebellion, and thoroughly soil his pants. Chapter 216, Fall of Falkreath, Part 2. Alternate title, Theatrics 2 Electric Bugaloo. Raven's POV. I was practically in a trance as I danced through the ranks of the increasingly panicking rebels, dozens of them falling to my blades every minute as I stepped forward at a pace that could almost be described as leisurely, only ever getting slowed down when I came face to face with one of the Stormcloak's more elite warriors, but even they did not manage to slow me long enough to make a difference. The legionaries behind me kept formation well enough, as Tullius had made sure to send in his Cyrodiilic veterans with me. The local recruits were tough and well-trained, but the experienced soldiers had already seen what a powerful mage could do in a battle while uncontested, so they were far less likely to panic when they saw me reap through the enemy ranks like they were so much dry grass. Whoever managed to step out of my way or was lucky enough to not be positioned in my path in the first place swiftly got cut down by the men following me, the slaughter slowing down only when I slowed down for the legionaries to switch ranks so that the front line could rest. About an hour into the leisurely stroll, or slaughter depending on which side you were on, I cut down the final group of lamella-bound men barring my path to the city square and the Jarl's keep, my eyes immediately landing on the rebel Jarl Dengir of Stoon and his retinue, and the multiple streets leading into the square with what must have been 1,000 rebels, though most of those were seemingly fresh recruits. "You will go no further, elf." Dengir steps out bravely, though I notice a slight shake in his step. "And who will stop me?" I ask, channeling my potent aura of terror as the freshest legionaries gather behind me, all of them looking almost insultingly clean for the slaughter we just caused. The image had the intended effect, as I swiftly noticed many of the rebel recruits hesitating or looking at each other with doubt in their eyes. Before Dengir could attempt to rally his men, I took one step forward and nearly laughed as hundreds of men took an instinctive step back. "I have a proposition for you all." A silence descends upon the battlefield as my words are heard by all, and just as expected, Dengir answers, "It was after all honorable to hear your opponent out. And what is this proposition? That we surrender and become slaves to the Empire once again?" "Nothing so basic." I chuckle and take unnecessary amount of pleasure in how shaky the Jarl becomes with each of my words. "I will offer you all a challenge," I declare while spreading my arms invitingly. Call forth your strongest champions and have them face me in combat. And should you win, I will call for a retreat and leave the battlefield. But should you lose, I will have your immediate and unconditional surrender." Dengir's brow furrows at my generous offer. "And what if we do not accept your generous offer?" he asks, practically gifting me with the victory. "If you do not, then I will stop holding back and use the voice to burn this entire city to the ground," I say gravely, and by the paleness of the many young men and women in the enemy ranks, I knew they believed me. I grow sick and tired of killing little boys, better suited for tilling soil than wielding weapons. So will you, O great warriors of Ulfric, step forth and fight? Or will you hide behind the bodies of those you swore to protect? And just as a finishing touch, I add, "You have a minute to give me your answer." "You are just buying time," Dengir snarls. "You have been fighting through the entire city already. What is to stop us from slaying you now that you are tired?" A deep, rumbling chuckle shakes the very air as I metaphorically look down at the tall Nord. I have not spent a single drop of magicka since I have entered the city. And just to make my point, I let it all out, coating the nearby buildings with my visible aura and oddly enough causing the weed around some of the houses to grow by a tiny bit. The old Jarl grits his teeth but shuts up and starts talking with his advisors. A nearby legionary officer steps next to me, Tiberius having been relieved halfway through the fight to recharge, and whispers, "Sir, should we not just storm the keep and be done with it? Isn't fighting them yourself too much of a risk?" With a barely perceptible shrug, I whisper back, "If any of them manages to kill me, then we already have a far greater problem than expected, and if I do defeat them, honorably." My mouth twists at the word with some disgust. "The ones that surrender will be far less likely to make problems later. Now get back to the ranks and tell them to look confident." The man nods and quickly moves away, the word of my command spreading swiftly. Seconds tick by as the rebels are stuck in furious debate. And just as the timer ends and I lift my burning hand, one of them steps out, much to the protest of his comrades, and raises his sword, tip pointed at me. "I will face you, Flame Tongue." "Very well." I nod at him approvingly, my voice lacking most of its previous menace. I step forward, my stance relaxed and my movement lacking any aggression. Even the Jarl grows silent as we start circling each other, the rebel warrior growing more unnerved by the moment as my completely silent steps fall onto the cobbled ground. With an emboldening battle cry, he charges at me shield first, but instead of striking anything, he feels only empty air as I pivot on my right foot, completely stepping out of the shield's way and delivering a swift counterattack with my sword right into his neck. Needless to say, he died immediately. "4," I say ominously and turn back to the Stormcloak leadership, the feeling of fear and panic among the enemy troops slowly turning into dreadful realization. Another brave Stormcloak steps out, this one wielding a warhammer and insultingly little armor. He died without even being able to take a swing. 3, I state lazily, rolling my R's. A shield maiden comes at me next, another sword wielder this time, and to my surprise she manages to hold me back for 3 entire exchanges with rapid reflexes and seemingly supernatural instincts. That did not stop my dagger from suddenly sinking into her unarmored armpit when she made a tiny misstep, however. 2, I say without even turning back to the now utterly terrified fools. A moment passes, but then my mind's eye shows me a man dressed in full Nordic steel plate, wielding a greatsword as tall as himself. This was the local Stormcloak commander, the so-called Sun Killer, who ironically shared a name with the current High King. "Come on then, Dragon Slayer." He points his sword at me while holding it one-handed. "I will have my final battle be worthy of song." "Oh?" I turn to him with a sudden curiosity. "You expect to lose and still step forward?" I ask, this time without a hint of mockery. He snorts. "I like to think of myself as a smart man." Says the Stormcloak. I can't help but snark back. The surprisingly chill warrior simply shrugs in response. Time will tell who was right and who was not. Admirably put, but you still avoid the point. I too now point my sword at him, but enough words, come and fight me. I cannot allow him to give his buddies too much time to calm down, so to Sovngarde he goes. He nods and grips his blade, and without any further preamble, sends out a rapid jab at my core. I naturally dodge immediately, but the man almost surprises me by swiftly repositioning and turning the jab into a swing. Too bad for him, I am a filthy cheater that should be permanently banned from warfare. I rapidly stomp the ground with my right foot and find myself airborne before he can even blink, the great blade passing harmlessly beneath my feet. Before he can reorient, I twist around myself and deliver a rapid kick to his shoulder, lightly denting the armor and sending him sprawling back, though still standing. "You are stronger than you look, elf," he praises, and I sense a battle-hungry smile behind his helmet. "And your arm is still intact." I praise back and immediately attack him with an overhead sword swing. He steps into it and uses his armored and wounded shoulder to bash my sword hand aside, earning himself another bone crack, and twists with surprising agility, flipping his sword over and going in for a close-range murder stroke. A rather unfortunate mistake for his part as I flood my flesh with magicka, turning it partially into ebony and grab his weapon, wrenching it away and purposefully throwing it back at the Jarl's keep and ruining the door, though I made sure it looked like an accident. Deciding to spare the surprisingly tough motherfucker, I unsummon my weapons and proceed to wail upon the still fighting Stormcloak leader, denting his armor in multiple places by the sheer force of my punches and swiftly bringing him to unconsciousness with a blow to the head. And then, completely ignoring my opponent's falling body, I turn back to Jarl Dengeir. And then there was one. Before the old fart could even retort, his shaky hands managed to drop his mace onto the ground, signaling his surrender for all to see. Soon all of the rebels were dropping their arms, while the freshly reinforced legionaries were spreading around and swiftly bringing the situation into order. "Fucking coward," I cursed the still shaking Jarl in my mind. And so I have decided that the defeated Jarl's nephew Sidgeir will be the one to take over his seat, as he had shown his loyalty to the Empire on multiple occasions. Tullius drones emotionlessly while staring at the pair of uncle and nephew. The only reason Sidgeir was being chosen was that he had built a surprising amount of connections while he was getting educated in the Imperial City. A bunch of nobles were vouching for him, and Tullius had neither the cloud to waste nor the nerves to try and go around their decision. Something I had no issues with. Slurp. The eyes of all those present snapped to me as I loudly slurped down my freshly made cup of coffee. The image of a Dunmer sitting on the Jarl's throne, slouched and half asleep, drinking a beverage imported from what was these days a foreign nation, created quite the contrast with a bunch of officials making declarations at each other while standing. As to why I was sitting on the throne, well, simply put, who was going to tell me otherwise? A thought occurs. I tilt my head, making me seem even more uncaring. Why should a family that had already shown their willingness to rebel be allowed anywhere near the position of Jarl? Or Duke for our Cyrodiilic friends present? I give the Imperial dignitaries a shallow nod, which they shakily return. Seeing through my intentions with surprising alacrity, Tullius explains, "Because Dengeir has already surrendered and accepted his fate of spending the rest of his days in house arrest, and Sidgeir has sworn to do his best to aid the war effort and serve the Emperor after the conflict has been won." I nod at the general and look at Sidgeir, a rather young Nord that seemed to be built far more for Cyrodiil's politics than Skyrim's rough bluster. "I trust that the general's belief in you is not misplaced, Lord Sidgeir." The paling Nord nods rapidly. "Of course, court mage. I will do my best as to make sure the hold continues serving the Empire and prospering under its just rule." "Make sure you do," I say with a lazy drawl. "It would be a damn shame if I learned something untoward was happening when I came to check in on your progress." His ambitions of laziness and corruption thoroughly cowed by my words, Sidgeir was promptly saddled with the title of Jarl and a massive requisition order, Red War Reparations. The forced enthusiasm he tried to display was very entertaining to observe. It was fun playing the bad cop from time to time. "What will you do now, court mage?" Tullius asks me as we leave the building, stepping out onto the freshly cleaned city square, bustling with stormcloaks giving up their weapons and armor to the strict-looking legionary quartermasters. "Back to Winterhold, and then probably off to investigate whatever Daedric threat decides to rear its ugly head next." I answer flippantly. He nods a couple of times, more to himself than me, before finally speaking again. I have heard some rumors about the Temple of Meridia near Solitude. He looks at me with a mix of curiosity and caution. Is there any credence to the rumors of you defeating a prince? I give him my sunniest smile while lazily twirling my sword around. I am certain I have no idea what you are talking about, General. I leave the frustrated man behind without another word and go to find my vampire sidekick. It was time to go home. Chapter 217, Home Sweet Home. You are certain you are ready? I asked Serana, who was now equipped with more modern clothing as to better fit in with the crowd, while her ethnic dress she kept in her Oblivion storage space. The vampire nods, though with a bit of hesitation. She had grown fond of staying with us over the course of the last week or so, and the fact that she had access to the Arcaneum as a college associate, and wasn't having that conversation with Savos Fun, didn't help her motivation to get moving, as she was apparently a massive bookworm. Right, I breathe out. So to reiterate, I raise a finger and she perks up. You will spend the least amount of time possible speaking to Harkon directly, and after making certain you know what their plans are, you will leave the castle quickly and quietly. If Harkon seems aggravated or overly motivated to get on with the prophecy, you will leave immediately. We do not need you getting killed by the madman. I still find the idea that he would kill me unbelievable. Serana frowns deeply, but I will do as you say. If he has truly fallen so far, I should not allow him to do as he wishes. After a brief moment of silence, she lightly inclines her head. Whatever happens, know that I am grateful for all you have done. It was my genuine pleasure. I offer a courtly bow and then with a bit less pomp offer, good luck. She nods and disappears with her own version of shadow step, only flying away when she leaves the town and makes sure no one is watching her. Still can't get my head around how ridiculously fast she is. I mutter with a smile and start walking back to the Sea Ghost's respite, getting the usual bows and greetings as I did so. The windy air of Winterhold is swiftly replaced by the merry atmosphere of a late evening meal in my inn, with dozens of the more well-off residents of the city sitting around large engraved tables and my musicians playing a cheerful but subdued tune. I step into a slightly elevated part of the main room, partly walled off from the rest with walls made of expertly carved wood, made in such a way as to allow me to observe the room without being easily seen myself. Inside were sat Savos and Tolfdir, the ancient duo of student and teacher, leisurely enjoying an incredibly popular house special, the pizza. It was only right that they did, of course, for who could deny the divine dish without suffering the consequences? A good evening to you, gentlemen. I greet them and take a seat, my own meal being brought in, but a moment later by my ever-attentive servants. Ah, Raven, my boy. Tolfdir gives me a genuine welcoming smile. I trust that you have dealt with whatever unfortunate issue cropped up, and I will give you the report if you want to go over it later. I refuse to retell the battle politely but firmly. I would much prefer to enjoy a peaceful meal without remembering all the gore. And I just made myself remember it. I frown, causing the old man to chuckle, but then swiftly shrug. Oh well, it isn't the first time, nor will it be the last. And without a hint of hesitation, I start gorging myself on the pizza. With utensils, of course, I was not an animal. Done with your overly pale friend? Savos asks, a hint of tease in his voice, but he knew not to joke about the topic outright. Yep, I say as I wipe my mouth with an enchanted handkerchief made from wispcloth. She felt that waiting any longer would agitate her father, and the Dawn Guard were given more than enough time and warning to prepare for an escalation. You are certain you know what you are doing? Tolfdir asks worriedly. The Volkihar are not to be trifled with, and any action against them should be taken in full force, something the college will support with all its might. Savos nods proudly. Indeed, it is the duty of the college to deal with such threats if they get out of hand, and even if we may have been reluctant to strike out against the Volkihar, we will offer all of our support should you need us to take them down. Thank you both, truly. I smile at them, but having you all join right now would just alert the lot of them to our actions, so it is best if I weaken them as much as possible beforehand. Though know that I will ask you to put your magic where your mouth is when the time comes. Savos smirks, but of course I dare not do otherwise, O Lord Dagoth. I raise my nose imperiously. Naturally. Tolfdir chuckles warmly. Ah, to be young. This naturally causes Savos to deadpan at him, but the old Nord simply raises an eyebrow, to which the current Archmage merely rolls his eyes. One of my oldest employees steps into our enclosed section a moment later with a silver tray carrying some kind of cake. Honored guests. He lightly bows to the two Archmagi. My lord. His bow is far more pronounced than the head chef has been working on a new dessert for some time now. He hopes you would honor him by tasting his newest masterpiece. He places the tray atop the table, revealing a marvelous-looking fruitcake. Oh ho! Tolfdir exclaims happily. Now this I must try. Savos merely prepares his cutlery in silence. As was tradition, I took the first bite and smiled happily at the explosion of taste, the hint of a nostalgic memory appearing in my mind as the masterfully made cake melted in my mouth. Give him my compliments and congratulations, I say after a moment of silence. The servant bows and leaves, and the dynamic duo of ancients start tasting the dessert themselves. The relaxing atmosphere makes it all too easy for me to forget the stress of the past few days. Say what you will about not being in any true danger, but keeping full focus for days on end without any sleep will get to anyone. Nothing a bit of good food and relaxing music can't fix. Home sweet home, I thought warmly and took another bite. Serana's POV. The constant light fog surrounding Castle Volkihar greets me like an old friend, the miasma created by my mother thousands of years ago, still remembering its primary function, namely keeping me alive above all others. I landed in front of the old stone bridge leading into the castle, a dozen gargoyles sitting motionlessly atop its stone fence. But no matter how motionless they may have seemed, I sensed their piercing eyes focusing on me before I even had the time to retract my wings. An odd mix of dulled feelings well up in my heart, mostly trepidation and worry, but also a tiny hint of hope that maybe, just maybe, my father may have decided to abandon his idiocy for all of our sakes. Still a naive little girl. A part of my mind I had been keeping in check for weeks since my awakening rears its ugly head. Shaking off the feeling of unease, I approached the gates. The old gatekeeper, who for some reason insisted on wearing full-plate armor at all times, even after thousands of years of no one approaching uninvited, immediately stood up and stared at me. Lady Serana, is that really you? He half gasped. Caspar. I greeted him as coldly as I could manage. It would not do to show them any emotion they might take as vulnerability. The man immediately started opening the gate and swiftly bowed before me once he was done. I said nothing and moved inside, already sensing the man mechanically lowering the gate as if it was his only purpose in unlife. Much to my relief, the first person I saw upon entering the castle was one of the rare people deserving of any actual respect within this castle. Garin Moretti stood there calmly looking at me, and the melancholic smile he showed upon seeing me told me far more than any words ever could. He inclined his head, almost apologetically, as he turned around and stepped into the great hall, loudly proclaiming, "My lord, everyone, Serana has returned." Holding back a sigh of frustration, I stepped out into the hall and nearly winced at the sight. It was all so dilapidated, multiple passages were outright caved in, and the vampires serving my father were feasting like beasts, openly eating raw flesh with their bare hands, and none of them caring about how dusty the tables and silverware were. Most of them I failed to recognize. Typical. My eyes then fell upon Orthiolf and Vingalmo, both of the simpering fools already hard at work, coming up with their inane and childish plots to win favor from my father. At least the fools are entertaining to observe as they play in the mud. It was as if they were all doing their best to create the worst possible caricature of what a noble vampire should be. My observations took less than a second, but none of it was missed by my father, who, with obviously false warmth, spread his arms welcomingly. "My dearest daughter returns at last." "Your only daughter." I hold back a quip. Any of my hopes of ever being anything more than a tool to the man are destroyed utterly by his question that followed immediately after the greeting. "I trust you have my Elder Scroll." I utterly failed to hold back my bitter retort, though at least I managed to keep the venom from my voice. "After all these years, that is the first thing you ask me." I keep my tone as flat as possible. Yes, I have the scroll. Yeah, so much for keeping your feelings hidden from the beasts. And like a dam bursting, the beasts around me start whispering among themselves, like a bunch of pitiful mortals given the tiniest crumb by their gods. Of course, I am delighted to see you, my daughter. Harkon Volkihar raises his hands placatingly, though his next words carry a hint of threat in them. Must I really say the words aloud? Probably sensing my utter disgust with him, he decides to press on. If only your traitor mother were here, I would let her watch this reunion before putting her head on a spike. How gentlemanly, I flatly point out, my recent host's mannerisms seemingly infecting me for a short moment. Liberating. Harkon's eyes narrow imperceptibly, but I know that my comment has enraged him almost to his breaking point. Not a very high standard. He straightens up. I am certain you are tired from your long journey back. Go and rest, and we shall catch up when you are ready. Fine. I acquiesce and brusquely walk off toward my room, as fast as possible without visibly running. I practically smash the ancient wooden door open, my eyes immediately scanning my room, only to find out that it has probably not been touched since I was buried thousands of years ago. My conversation with Harkon replays in my mind repeatedly as I sit down on a half-rotten chair, my breathing growing harder by the moment and the walls feeling as if they were attempting to swallow me whole. Home sweet home, I think bitterly. Chapter 218, A Spontaneous Party. Raven's POV. I tug at the fishing line patiently, the tiniest of vibrations passing all the way to the bait and causing a chain reaction resulting in a rather massive trout landing into the half-filled basket floating next to me. That is 23 for me, I say smugly. It isn't a competition. Savos attempts to hide his childish pout with a disappointed sigh, failing utterly. A loud crunching sound draws my attention to my right just in time to see Shalazar simply grab a fish straight out of the water and scarf the whole thing down, chewing it with bones and all like a complete animal. Right, I acquiesce, pointedly not looking at the visibly amused lizard wizard. After some pleasant silence and a couple more fishes caught devoured Savos comments, I do have to admit this little exercise of yours is a great idea. Indeed. Shalazar exclaims, his mouth almost disturbingly clean. To think there would be such a method both glorious and entertaining to advance my art. Almost sensing my discomfort, he gives me a toothy grin, almost shark-like in its appearance, not to mention the food. He does a chef's kiss, absolutely decadent. Suppressing the primal shiver of discomfort, I seek anything to distract me from the ravenous lizard and soon notice a bunch of sailors gaping at our trio of fisher people, most of them looking completely baffled by the sight of us. I feel like I should explain just why that is. After a day of returning from the battlefield and just relaxing, I still didn't feel like jumping back into any of my projects, so I decided to do something unusual to relax. And now Savos, Shalazar, and myself were levitating half a meter above water and doing our best to not disturb the fish while levitating for hours on end. It was fun, especially when some of the apprentices tried copying us after a while and all ended up getting a free cold bath after a minute or so of levitation. All three of us got some free chuckles out of them, looking at us with pleading eyes and their utter devastation as we refused to help them at all. They lived. As to how the three of us remained floating for almost the entire day. 2 words: magic weed. Still, all things must end, and so did our little fishing trip. With 6 full baskets of fish caught by Savos and myself, while Shalazar somehow managed to devour 4 times his body weight of trout in a short 14 hours. Bloody animal didn't even take a single bathroom break either. Naturally, all that fish had to go somewhere, so another feast at the respite it was. We even invited the nearly drowned students as a bit of compensation. The whole thing turned into a party as more and more people arrived and just started vibing. With the atmosphere and the music grew more and more cheery. Many of the masters and all of my colleagues' friends who were present joined in on the spontaneous celebration. It was almost supernatural. Wait. My hand holding the completely ineffectual mead stops dead in its tracks as I scan the entire building within an instant. Morrigan was drunk and attempting to make a very uncomfortable Thorfinn try out her potions as an advertisement. while a bunch of the guardsmen kept encouraging him to go for it. Marwyn was still talking about necromancy with Phineas, even as the latter was barely listening while going over anatomical diagrams and pretending to drink simple water. Tolfdir was leading a crowd dance while disguised as a cheery young man, two women leaning on him from both sides, and Savos was sitting at the counter next to a suspiciously familiar-looking man. No, wait, that isn't a man. That is a bloody day. Fuck-mothering Sanguine turned his head and gave me a cheerful wink while patting Savos on the back and offering him another ale as the two talked like old friends. A newly formed Sanguine rose already attached to one of Savos's pockets. Noticing the stare-down, my grandfather gave me a reassuring wave, while his aura gave me a feeling of, I know what I am doing. Instead of bothering with dissuading him, I simply shrugged and looked back at the Daedric prince getting drunk in my establishment, probably for free as well. With a flick of my hand, my blade appeared, visible only to the Daedra, and I took great pleasure in the widening of his eyes as I caressed the blade, causing artificial sparks to fly off of it. With my message, read threat of vigorous violence, sent to the rowdy fucker, I returned to my own game of seeing who is doing the dumbest shit just in time for someone to sit down next to me, someone rather familiar. Why, Raven, I was so disappointed that you didn't invite me to your little get-together. Mephala, disguised as a sinfully seductive Dunmer lady, sat down next to me, a cup of sweet-smelling poison in her hand, while the other supported her perfectly proportioned face. Not being bothered by her sudden presence in the least, I shrugged. I didn't know about the cause of the little get-together until just now, so you will have to excuse my impertinence. Oh, how could I ever stay mad at my favorite mortal? She titters. Want one? I offer her a cigar in lieu of an answer, which she naturally accepts. 2 plumes of blue smoke and a couple of relaxed sighs. Later, I decide to ask, you have been oddly silent after the whole Meridia debacle. She pretends as if she had forgotten all about it, before awkwardly chuckling, Ah, that? She offers me an eye smile while covering her smirking mouth. After your thorough humiliation of the sun, bitch, we all decided to pounce on her while she was down. You've given me a lot of work to deal with, young man. Her entire demeanor shifts from a seductive young lady into a teasing mature woman. I roll my eyes. Yes, yes. As if the whole thing won't revert back to the status quo in a mere century or so. You Daedra are so melodramatic. Oh, come now, Mephala pouts. You must be at least a bit happy to hear that she got her ass repeatedly and roughly served to her by Molly and the others. And I am sure you did not join in the proverbial gangbang. I deadpan at her, causing her to giggle disturbingly. But of course, who do you take me for? She retorts cheerfully. I let out an amused snort, finally allowing Mephala to see my true feelings as my eyes narrow and let out a violent red glow. Of course I love hearing that she got fucked over by you lot. I practically growl out, only the loud music stopping people from noticing my barely hidden fury. If I didn't have things to do down here, I would have offered to join in myself. Letting my frustration slowly dissipate and taking another long inhalation of magical smoke, I sigh. Is what I would love to say if I didn't know for a fact I would end up as a smear on the ground almost immediately upon even dreaming of entering her domain. The smile which had disappeared from her face after my previous declaration slowly returns to Mephala. Good, I thought you grew stupid for a moment there. I snort, you wish. She rolls her eyes. Your refusal only motivates me to try harder. And your attempts only serve to entertain me further. I retort without a hint of hesitation. We stare at each other for a moment before bursting into a fit of quiet laughter, Mephala turning somewhat serious after a short while. Back to business, unfortunately, I do not have all day. Right. I turn serious as well. What did you need? Why do you think I always need something? She half pouts, and noticing my swiftly developing deadpan, she speaks up. I wanted to tell you that many of my servants are eager to get summoned by you, should you ever wish it. I raise an eyebrow. Oh, that is good to know. I expected a bit more awe. The god of lies and murder now pouts fully. I shrug. I already have my mortal forces, but I guess that a Dremora or two wouldn't be amiss where I am inevitably going to end up. Now, what else did you need? She clutches at her heart. To become predictable so quickly. How shameful. Kindly do not dirty my plush seats with your degeneracy. I narrow my eyes. Too late. She gives me an innocent smile, and I can practically hear the tehe hidden behind it. Taking another shot of marijuana and counting to 10, I open my eyes once more and ask slowly, "What did you need, Lady Mefala?" She seems just about ready to take another shot at bringing me discomfort, but thinks better of it as I pull out a mostly fresh fish from my storage and give her a threatening stare. "Fine, be like that." She huffs. "I wanted to tell you that if you want to get the mace, you should get to it soon. Molag has been focused on the Meridia situation, but he will inevitably get interested in the mortal world before long." "Still interested in the filthy hunk of metal, eh?" I ask lazily, but then just wave the question off before she can answer. "Fine, Markarth was on my list anyway, considering the filthy Namirans crawling in its dark crevices." Mefala sniffs the air in disgust. "Ugh, her." "Exactly." I nod with vigorous amounts of hatred in my eyes, though something tells me that another of your colleagues is already involved in the Molly situation. I give her a sidelong glance. "Should I be worried?" She blinks before seemingly remembering what I was talking about and waves it off. "Just do what you want. She doesn't care about her servants nearly as much as the rest of us." "And if she decides to get interested?" I deadpan, fully expecting the final third of the tribunal to be paying attention to me. "Then you deal with her as you desire. She knows not to push too far." Mefala responds with surprising amounts of steel in her tone. "Right." I lean back into my seat. "Another one?" I offer her a second cigar, and she nods eagerly, apparently taken by the neat little things. My eyes drift over the gathered people, all of them falling into more and more ridiculous drunken behavior, thankfully all of it harmless. My eyes widen in sheer horror as I see Shalazar still, devouring fish. It is moments like this I regret my newfound immunity to alcohol. General POV. "So that is the reason you don't visit nearly as often?" Sanguine asks Savos, not an ounce of judgment in his voice. Savos smirks. "Indeed, life doesn't seem nearly as dull anymore." Sanguine pretends to sniff and wipe off a tear. "They grow up so fast." He laments falsely before sending another stealthy glance toward Raven, his eyes widening a fraction as he notices his drinking companion. After a moment of silence, Sanguine's eyes gleamed with interest. "He does seem rather interesting. Maybe I should visit more often." "Do that at your own risk." Savos deadpans with such certainty it outright scares the drunken Daedric prince for a split second. "What do you mean by that, Sav?" said Prince asks, swiftly hiding his discomfort behind a curious gaze. Savos merely takes a drink and whistles, pretending not to hear anything. "Come on, man, don't blueball me here," Sanguine begs after a bit more silence. "Huh? You were saying something?" The Archmage looks at him, genuinely confused. "Just give me another drink," Sanguine deadpans. "That is what I thought," Savos Aran smirks. Chapter 219. The Eternal Grind continues. The surprise party at the respite ended without anyone getting hurt, mortal or otherwise. The locals had some fun, and everyone went on their merry way once the party died out, and whoever caused the atmosphere finally left. Which one was first, no one will ever know. Though Raven had a sinking feeling that this was not the last time this kind of thing would happen. A good old party never killed no one. He put it out of his mind and focused on what is truly important, the ever-evolving march of the grind. Raven's POV. Slowly and carefully, I apply more and more pressure on the artificial bone in my hand. The force of my grip spreads across the whole thing almost perfectly, while it bends only slightly, allowing the force to dissipate further without compromising on its base integrity. Definitely slightly above baseline Imperial. I press a bit harder and push it even further until I foresee that any more would break it, just above baseline Nord as well. I comment as Marwyn furiously scribbles down my words. As predicted, Phineas comments from his standing table, "We could have pushed it further, but the goal is to create a functional living body, not a combat suit." He settled on the word, a hint of morbid amusement in his tone. I let out a dry chuckle. I'd say that was disturbing, but at this point, I've disassembled so many people myself that not looking at bodies like they are just meat bags would just end up with me becoming a monk. Phineas cackles, "Oh, woe is us when Raven the Butcher realizes the weight of his sins." I blink and point at him threateningly. "I don't like you very much right now." And of course, the only answer he has is another Skeletor-esque cackle. "In any case," I say, pointedly staring at the Lich, "I believe our next goal should be the circulatory system." "Naturally," Phineas half scoffs. "We cannot even begin with the neural system without it, so we must trudge through the ancient art of bloodworks." Speaking of blood, I cup my chin thoughtfully. I might be able to get us an ancient vampire to help with that one whenever she returns from her most recent excursion. "Oh ho ho." Phineas rubs his hands while Marwyn just sighs in silence. "You did not inform me you have made such a prestigious acquaintance." The Lich seems almost offended at the fact. I shrug. I've had other priorities, but seeing her drain corpses into blood potions like it was a damn art tells me she could be useful for this, so I remembered her. "As if you are even capable of forgetting such things at this point." He outright scoffs this time. Remembering something and keeping it in mind are two very different things. I say with exasperation, only to realize that the whole conversation was pointless. "But you already knew that and are probably fucking with me right now." "Oh, don't be such a stick in the mud." The dead man rolls his inexistent eyes. "The ladies won't appreciate you if you keep ruining everyone's fun." A beat of silence passes. "What would you know about ladies, Phineas?" I ask with a cruel smirk. "After all, you don't even have the tools necessary to even consider the ladies." He stops completely, slowly turning his head to me, and then to his apprentice, his bones creaking audibly. "Marwyn," the Lich says with immense gravitas. "Sir," the Breton gulps. "Fetch me my tomes," Phineas commands. Marwyn scratches the back of his head. Which ones?" "All of them," his undead master snarls. "I will leave you to it then." I cackle and skedaddle out of there as Phineas starts throwing curses, verbal not magical I feel I need to point out, at me at increasingly worrying speeds. "You need another number 3 in between the 14 and 16 to properly support the movement." I absent-mindedly tell my retainer as I focus on disassembling Imzark's puzzle box. Yggdrasil stops tinkering with the spiders, as does her assistant. One of the guards showed a surprising affinity for Dwemetech, and I've since had him following Yggdrasil about when she does her own research or I give her a quick lesson. The young mare could perform quality maintenance on spiders and spheres after only a couple weeks of tutelage, so he was definitely going places someday. "That makes complete sense," Yggdrasil exclaims as if she were the one to come to the conclusion. Ignoring her egotistical wailing, I refocus on the massive Centurion chassis in front of me. I had so far managed to construct the legs, arms, and most of the torso, but the central system still eluded me for the most parts. I could just ram a dynamo core in there and be done with it, but that was not the point of creating it in the first place. I wanted to truly understand how the Dwemer managed to mass-produce these damn things and then improve upon the design until I could practically drown my enemies in heavily armored automata. The only conclusion I've come to so far has been to personalize a massive enchantment matrix for the automaton, giving it far more autonomy and power, but at the cost of production speed and expenses. Still, giving Gatecrasher a younger sibling would be a worthy first step on the right path. Might as well get to it then. Dwemetech adept to expert. Slowly, my teacher for the day comments quietly, gently, like you were caressing a newborn. The incredibly thin bubble of magicka surrounding me slowly spreads to the dozen or so scamps we had summoned for the purpose of testing and envelopes them, their expressions growing confused and then content after only a couple seconds of contact. "Good," Master Nellorin praises. "Now invert the feeling. Stop holding back and let anger flow into your targets." His demeanor shifts into a far more aggressive one as he speaks. The bubble of magicka grows much more unstable, though nowhere near the point of turning into a destruction spell, and the scamps are slowly forced out of their stupor, their eyes narrowing and involuntary growls leaving their tiny throats. "Excellent," Drevis Nellorin exclaims. "Now calm them down once again." This time it takes my magicka thrice as long to revert the weakling Dremora into a state of peaceful contentedness. but I do manage it with enough focus. Nelarin looks over the scamps, both of us noticing one of them frothing at the mouth, as his mind is no doubt damaged by my meddling, but neither of us cares for the little creature. "You are getting the hang of this surprisingly quickly. It is almost astonishing," he comments after completing his observation. Retracting my magicka, I shrug. This feels like it is essentially just following the principles of alteration and adding a bit of finesse to it, so following the steps is relatively easy. I doubt I will be able to do ridiculous things like the sound trick you did when I first arrived. The illusionist nods, only a tad miffed at my comparison of the two schools, but I had offered a minor favor to him if he helped me learn to fuck with people's minds on a large scale as quickly as possible, so he swiftly refocused on his task. "Very well then, try angering them again, and then we shall move to courage." Dozens of scamps had their minds utterly shattered before we were done. Illusion, adept to expert, plus large-scale emotional manipulation. "Come on, get up and attack as one." I bark at a large group of my nearly exhausted guardsmen as the rest of my house members stare at the scene with a mix of fear and respect. The 12 Dunmeri halberdiers return to formation with surprising efficiency after the beating I gave them and point their weapons at me, all of them positioning in such a way that would allow them to defeat someone of my supernatural speed and strength with minimal casualties. Hjolmir, the captain of Winterhold's own guard force, gives them an appreciative nod as they do so. He had offered to help my men train up into a respectable force for my aid during the infiltration debacle, and I accepted instantly. Both of the Eben Frosts I knew were absolute monsters when it came to their profession of choice. I would have to visit the clan at some point to see if it is just the two of them. I both dread and anticipate the mind-breaking discoveries I would make there. My trailing thoughts halt as the Dunmeri unit advances as one, only some among them faltering due to the pain coursing through their limbs. With a challenging smirk, I launch myself into the formation once again, slashing and kicking through their ranks as they attempted to imperil my path at every single movement. Only two of them managed to come close to delivering glancing blows before we were done. "Excellent work, everyone." I clap my hands happily, but only groans of pain and exhaustion answer me. "You can take the rest of the day off and order whatever you want from the cooks. Just don't make their jobs unnecessarily complex, please." The groans are far more enthusiastic this time. "Hjolmir." I turn to the captain as most of my subjects leave. "Raven." He nods with a smirk, already predicting my request. "Up for a bout?" I flick my blunted sword at him. His grin widens as he grabs a practice mace from a nearby rack. "I'd thought you'd never ask." We then proceeded to bash each other into near unconsciousness for an entire hour before we were forced apart by a mildly disturbed Davos. I did manage to convince Tolfdir's descendant to visit more often so that we could train with our full power. He was almost giddy when I asked, in fact. Swordsmanship, adept to expert. Dagger-wielding, apprentice to adept. "You are surprisingly good at this," Davos mutters almost inaudibly as we sneak by a guard patrol marching through Winterhold's less wealthy quarters. We stop sneaking about and stand behind a hidden nook just in time for me to give him a glacially cold deadpan look. He blinks, "Right, patron." "For someone so competent, you can be a downright idiot sometimes, Davos," I comment, though there is no real heat or judgment in my voice. "What is going on over there?" A voice interrupts our conversation, and we are soon met with a group of 5 or so guardsmen. Both of us send a glance to the other before swiftly bolting it out of there, leading the poor guardsmen on a wild goose chase through the poorer sections of the city before loosing them fully in the sprawl of poorly repaired homes and houses. "I'd say you would pass as an experienced recruit in the guild." Davos grades my performance. I shrug. I prefer blowing my problems up to sneaking around them." "Can't argue with that." He chuckles somewhat awkwardly. "Want to try and sneak into the college?" I ask, only half joking. The paleness of his face makes me break out into laughter. Sneak, apprentice to adept. Ah, the sweet smell of progress. Chapter 220. Dragonskin. 2 weeks had passed since Serana's departure and the sudden ascension of my establishment from a mere inn to a gathering place for Daedric drunkards. I exaggerate, of course. Sanguine had only visited once more and was, to my great surprise, rather reserved with his powers and influence and contented himself with chatting up Savos, whom I learned was a very old, drinking buddy of his. I want to judge him, I really do, but I have no ground to stand on there. Reports about the war were also still streaming in at a constant pace. I was adamant about receiving news about even the smallest of skirmishes ever since the attack on Helgen Pass, just in case I would be able to notice another discrepancy in enemy movements. Thankfully, there was no need for me to engage in any further warfare, as all three, now two fronts, had regressed to simple constant skirmishes as the two forces attempted to scramble and react to the development of Falkreath's fall. Tullius wanted to press the advantage now that he had the enemy outnumbered, but Ulfric had a massive terrain advantage to his defense, and he had somehow managed to smuggle uncountable raiders into the territories of Dawnstar, who were now harrying all the holds surrounding it, forcing the legion already overburdened with pacifying Falkreath to spread out and attempt to catch their erratic raids. In short, the war was slowing down, and as Skyrim's harsh autumn winds started to blow, snow had already begun to cover the northernmost areas of the province, no doubt delaying any large-scale battle even further. No one wanted to attack Nords during winter, not even the Nords themselves. I ceased my pondering on politics and warfare once I reached my destination. Tolfdir had sent me a message via Wizard's Orb that he was close to making a breakthrough with the Dragonskin spell and wanted me to participate. The fact that using such a spell would push me into low mastery of alteration went unsaid. The metallic doors opened, leading me straight into Tolfdir's own lab and study, where the ancient Nord was eagerly writing on a copy of the spell's ever-expanding runic matrix. The enlarged version covered half the damn wall, and it was a big wall as well. "Ah, you are finally here." Tolfdir greets me without turning around. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." I respond genuinely, "You said you finally had a breakthrough?" He turns around and nods eagerly, his eyes practically shining with excitement. "I have indeed. The final hurdle of replicating the true magical resistance of the dragons was indeed hidden behind the usage of Dovazul, as you have said." He chuckles. "Since you were absent so often, I've had to invest the time to learn the alphabet myself." I wince slightly. "My sincere apologies for that. A raised hand interrupts me. "I did not mind learning an ancient tradition of my people." His eyes narrow. "The only reason I've not touched it before were the Greybeard's teachings. But with what is coming, I cannot allow a potential avenue of defending my people to go unused due to base dogma." I blink slowly, a trace of terror running down my spine. Tolfdir with the Thum. Fuck Scorch wisely surmises my thoughts. "Well, I am glad you enjoyed learning it." I praise somewhat lamely before deciding to return to the main topic of today. "Now about that spell." The old man begins excitedly explaining the whole process to me. His enthusiasm at the making of this specific spell was so infectious that I couldn't help but be drawn along with it, and we both spent hours tuning the final bits of the spell, making sure that the thing is as efficient as possible before we even attempted it. Finally, as the sun had started to set, we stopped our brainstorming session, with the wall now being fully covered by a mind-boggling runic matrix. If one were to run a downright unhealthy amount of magicka, for most people, through said wall, it would find itself covered by illusory scales, which would outright ignore any offensive magic below the expert level and resist most of the things above it. And as if that wasn't enough, it boosted its receptiveness to further alteration as well. I found myself standing at the room's center, most of my clothes save for a pair of pants gone, as I kept observing myself over and over and running constant calculations in my mind. Just thinking about even attempting to do this with my once mundane mind sent a feeling of dread straight into my heart, but I refocused easily enough. It was decided that I would be the first to attempt casting the spell, as I could see the magic moving around without outside interference, and my natural toughness was actually higher than Tolfdir's own, though I doubted it would remain as such now that he was practicing the voice. The time came and Tolfdir spoke, his voice filled with both worry and excitement. "Begin." An immense torrent of magicka surged from within me as I started forming rune after rune, a mix of arcane and draconic, soon covering most of my body in a dazzling display of amber. As the final 13th layer of the spell connected with the first, I felt a sudden metaphysical snap within my mind and felt my skin tingle as it glowed with power. Grey skin was replaced with blackened scales, tinged with purple as I felt nearly all of my natural magicka reserve leave my body. I took deep breaths and found that I could move as well as before casting the spell. Even better, I found after jumping lightly. "Raven," Tolfdir's concerned voice brought me out of my thoughts. "Are you well?" I blinked, did a couple of stretches, and scanned myself from within and without. Nodding to myself more than I did to him, I spoke, "Yep, feeling just fine." I flexed my right arm lightly, feeling the magically imbued flesh constrict with immense power. Better than ever, really. He sighs in relief before his eyes suddenly take on a dangerous glint. "Good," he says ominously as a ball of fire forms in his hand. "That means we can begin testing." I couldn't stop the concerned gulp in time as I asked, "Is that really necessary?" "Don't put yourself down like that," he smirks. "How can a mere wall compare to you?" His smirk widens. "And I need to teach you to not ignore an old man's concern." "Isn't that a bit petty?" I ask with growing fear. A second fireball joins the first. "Good luck," Scorch exclaims helpfully. One unnecessarily long testing session later. The spell finally stopped working after 1 entire hour, the highly efficient magicka cycle working a bit too well for my current situation. I slump on a nearby seat with a sigh, my robes summoned the moment Tolfdir stopped pelting me with different kinds of magic. I didn't even know the man could use master-level spells of so many elements. In conclusion, Tolfdir begins with only slight smugness in his tone. "The spell works even better than projected." "Yeah," I nod, though that isn't much of a surprise when you remember that most of our tests were done on a damned wall. "Observations?" he asks in his teacher voice. And just like that, we spent even more time brainstorming now that we had live data, improving the spell even further and increasing its efficiency to downright scary levels. If I were to cast it again, it would last for even longer and only take 2/3 of my natural magicka. And that was going to be blatantly unfair in battle, considering that I had more than double that just from my rings, and the spell made me outright immune to non-divine fire and made most destruction magic feel like a nice breeze against my skin. And that is without even mentioning the strength increase. If before I could crush iron, now I could outright grind it to dust. Another 2 hours later, and well into the deep night, it was Tolfdir's turn to stand in the room's center half naked. The man was, as one might expect, utterly ripped below those wizardly robes, and now he was about to make himself even more disgustingly powerful. "Good." He took a deep breath, and after a nod from me, started channeling his own magicka. The arcane runes covered him with even more efficiency than when I used them, but his lack of skill at applying Dovazul still had him finishing the casting far slower than I did. The spell made him feel outright invincible to my sight, as he was covered in scales of earthly bronze, incredibly dangerous-looking claws extending from his fingers as well. Was the color scheme a subconscious thing, or did it have more to do with one's lineage? No matter, I had vengeance to serve. Seemingly feeling the sudden danger he was in, Tolfdir looked up from his clawed hands just in time to see me overcharging solar fire in my right hand and crimson lightning in my left. The ancient mage gulped. "You wouldn't strike an old man, would you?" I smirked at him, my wide smile no doubt giving my face a demonic appearance as I cruelly declared dodge. I left the Tower of Alteration well after midnight, a satisfied sigh leaving me as the catharsis of testing the spell's integrity on Tolfdir still lingered in my mind. He took it all in good humor, obviously, and we spent a short amount of time going over the last bits before I left for another expedition, and he could focus on developing the full, flesh version of the spell. All in all, today was a most productive day, especially considering the notification I got when I left the tower. Alteration, expert to master. Mind 53 to 55. Vit 46 to 47. Mag 1020 to 1080. Trait enhanced, unbound. The bindings of your race are less stringent, allowing you abandon your roots or refine them with sufficient effort. I let out an appreciative whistle, the path of my long-term plans smoothening once more as my power grew and both quantity and quality. Though I felt I was forgetting something important. I arrived at my home in the dead of night, the guards at the door giving me oddly sheepish looks as I passed. My mind swiftly came to the conclusion of what might be going on, but I decided to be sporting about it and pretended not to notice the trio of massive magical presences in my study. Entering said study, I found Savos, Shalazar and Tolfdir already seated in formal robes, all three of them giving me expectant looks as I took my seat. One might wonder if there is some kind of crisis happening with all of you gathered like this. I quip, pretending to not know what is going on. Or a party, Savos wisely points out. Shalazar raises his hairless brow at me. A fool you are not, my glorious student. Cease playing pretend at being one. He tries sounding firm, but the excited squeak in his voice reveals his true feelings of pride. We have gathered tonight. Tolfdir, as the oldest, begins his oddly official speech, to welcome the fourth member of our little company of scholars and warriors. Indeed, Shalazar squeaks, no longer hiding his true mood. For too long have we languished at a mere trio of thunderous terrors. So it is my greatest honor, Savos summons an ornate cup filled with no doubt incredibly expensive wine, to welcome Winterhold's fourth resident archmage. I stare at them all for 10 long seconds before blurting, "How long did it take you all to choreograph that?" The trio stares back at me, all three attempting to look aggrieved by my words, but Shalazar bursting into a fit of squeaky laughter, while the more humanoid duo stare at him in annoyance, soon breaks the atmosphere. So we have some kind of archmage club now, I ask as we finally calm ourselves. Savos shrugs, just a nice little formality that Tolfdir came up with when I first reached the rank. Indeed, Shalazar adds, mine was a glory most potent when I was invited by the dynamic duo, and my pride most overwhelming when we turned it into the terrifying trio. He spreads his tiny arms, now the world shall tremble before the fearsome foursome. Tolfdir hums, a hidden melancholy hidden behind his happy expression. I felt that those with the potential of living as long as we, no doubt should connect, and so I begun with myself and my student. I slump into my chair with a mildly annoyed huff. What a sobering thought. A couple of knocks at the door breaks the ensuing silence, and seeing who is on the other side, I bid them, enter. The doors open, revealing Serana, her clothes covered in blood, and 8 of my guards, half pointing their halberds at her. The trio of Archmagi all look at her at the same time, the weight of their combined gazes sending a shiver down her spine. We have a problem, she declares, uncaring for the present company. Well, this ought to be interesting.